Part 13, Chapter 40, Weather Decisions. Jim and Pimba arrived at Camp 2 joining the rest of the team. Michael soon caught up with them and had said, "Well, I've got bad news, worse news, and horrible news." He went through the three options that John Paul had laid out with Cyclone Amphen. Jim looked shocked. "He wants us to go back to base camp and then come back up to C2 in a couple of days? I can't do that. Oh, I guess I'm out." About that time, Pablo walked in to welcome Jim. "Yeah, I had the same thought. I don't know if I have enough gas in my tank to get to the summit. I know I can't go back down base now and then come back up here and do it all over again. I'm out too." Jim found a modicum of comfort that Pablo, half his age, was also struggling. "It's just one of three options. If the cyclone veers east and then we're in the clear, maybe we should ask Dawa for another puja," Michael said, trying to lighten the mood. The team milled around Camp 2 that afternoon, hoping for new weather to update over dinner. Harper grabbed her Theriah phone out of her pack and walked over to the steep hillside that leads to the West Ridge. "We might not go," Harper began the short conversation with her husband, Mark. Harper knew from other expeditions that those at home had no way of tracking their progress in real time, so she tried to keep them updated on significant events. "So when will you know?" he asked her. "Maybe later today or tomorrow. I'll send an SMS when I know. I want to save the batteries for the South Col and, of course, for the summit. That is, if I get there." Harper knew it was now harder on her family than on her. Also, Harper knew that what was going on, they had to wait. They had to guess. No way of knowing. They just didn't know. The team slowly came to the dining tent, hoping for the best, but prepared for the worst. No one wanted to go down, not even John Paul or Dawa. But if Amphen was going to hit Everest with 70-mile-an-hour winds and 2 feet of snow, it was really the only option left. They all sat on the three-legged golf chairs around the small dining table. Dutch kept falling over and over again, every time with a laugh, giving everyone a moment of comic relief. He was doing it on purpose, just to entertain the group. Tony just stared at the door, waiting for John Paul. Everyone was making small talk about families, hopes, and fears when he walked in with Dawa. "Got news," John Paul started. Harper took a drink of her hot lemon while Claudia locked ears at Pablo. "It's good news," John Paul started, until Dawa interrupted him with, "Well, maybe it's good news." Tony was getting impatient and blurted out, "Okay, so what is it?" "Okay, the updated forecast has Amphen moving east. Everest is out of the cone of uncertainty," John Paul said. "That's fantastic. So, Dawa, why the maybe?" Dutch probed. Dawa sat down sipping hot Sherpa tea. "It's a forecast, and I still have many memories of the same thing with Fanny last year. It went east and it came back west. We're not in the clear yet. Fagan sent me this low-res image of the track. I've got it on my phone." Everyone gathered around John Paul. He turned on his phone. It was amazing that he got a signal at Camp 2. It was weak, and he had to walk around the western cone using his phone like a divining rod, looking for water. But in this case, it was a cell phone signal. They looked at the map and quickly saw the track moving away from Nepal and that Everest was no longer in the cone. "I like this," Jim said, putting his hand on Pablo's shoulder. Claudia put hers around his waist. "So what's the plan now?" Bart asked. John Paul addressed the group. "Let's move up to C3 tomorrow, out the door at 3 a.m., up the Lhotse face, and it's going to be cold, between -10 and -20 Fahrenheit. And also the winds are expected to be gusting up to 45 miles an hour, so the wind chill, that's going to be the problem. Not the air temperature, but the wind chill. It's going to be brutal. Wear everything you got. You wear your down suit, your goggles, your mittens, the works." "I was liking this plan, but aren't we moving up too early?" Harper asked John Paul. "No, the forecast calls for the wind to dip under 25 miles an hour with a mean speed of only 3. And that's basically calm on the morning of the 21st, and then it picks back up." Dawa took back over. "Remember, the winds could return, or the cyclone could still veer back. I've been guiding on Everest for 20 years, and one thing I know is that nothing is certain." "Well, sounds like we have a window," Tony said, reaching for more vegetables. Chapter 41, A Stormy Lhotse Face. The wind in the temperature forecast was spot on as you left Camp 2 for Camp 3. It was cold, very cold. The still air temperature was -20 Fahrenheit, and it was windy, very windy, gusting to over 45 miles an hour most of the time, but it was at a steady 20 miles per hour. That made for a mind-numbing wind chill of -48 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. minus 48 Fahrenheit. They were operating at the very edge of physical tolerance. What are we doing? Dutch asked himself. He was already cold, even with two base layers under his down-filled one-piece suit. He bought a new one before coming to Nepal and he went for the best. He spent $1,200 on this down covering. So why am I so cold? He asked himself. He continued the conversation as he made his way up the relatively flat section of the upper western Coombe above Camp 2. He was in the middle of Mount Everest John Paul's team. There were 9 climbers, each with a personal Sherpa. Also, there were 5 climbing Sherpas, including one assigned to Jim to carry us extra oxygen, and the rest to be there just in case of an emergency. John Paul was bringing up the rear, there to assist anyone who needed it. The climbing Sherpas were in the lead. For the first time on the expedition, the team made good progress in challenging conditions. Their collective 25 headlamps lit up the well-defined boot path. They could see lines of light already on the Lhotse face. It appeared several other teams were already whirling the dice, trying to nab the tiny weather window. Technically, the season had 11 days left. On June 1st, the icefall doctors would remove the ladders in the icefall, closing the Nepal side of the mountain. Tibet would go on into June, giving them a much more latitude in their schedule. Harper moved in lockstep behind Mingma, who led the train. He set a steady but swift pace, knowing that in these conditions, speed is your friend and keeps you warm. Dutch started to feel better. His steady movements were warming his body. Aaron and Bart were doing well as well. Tony, Mitchell, Michael, Claudia, and Pablo and Jim, they were all at the end of the line. They were losing ground to the rest of the team. This was a difficult day. Last night, John Paul told the team, tomorrow will be the toughest day we've had yet, given the conditions, but it'll pale in comparison to Summit Day. Climbing Everest is all about altitude. The section between the balcony and the south summit may be a bit easier with fresh snow, but that area is steep and has exposed rocks. It starts at 27,500 and ends at the south summit at 28,700. Jim was now using supplemental oxygen at 4 liters per minute. He was in a steady but slow pace, just as John Paul had advised him to do. Pimba was a step or two in front, continuing to look back on his charge. Jim began to think about his experience last year when he went to Camp 3 without O's. This time it felt easier, but he knew the hardest part was when he'd see those first tents in the lower Camp 3 and knew he had another hour or more to reach his tent at upper Camp 3. Mount Everest guides placed their tent 500 feet higher than the lower ones. The team reached the base of the Lhotse face in the large Bergstrom. Harper paused before stepping on a ladder. Everyone used it to overcome the gap. Harper knew from studying the history of Everest that the large icy hole was the grave for at least 2 people. In 2002, a British climber slipped midway on the face, descending in a fierce storm. He fell to his death into the Bergstrom. A Sherpa had a similar face in 1997. Stay clipped in, Harper lectured herself. Mingma, already across the ladder, paused. Didi? He said gently. I'm okay, Harper replied as she crossed the ladder and clipped into the fixed rope. The high winds that scoured the face of any fresh snow. Now it was hard, packed ice. Tony struggled to get purchase with his crampons. Silently, he cursed himself for not putting a sharper edge on the blades. He began to sidestep more than any other footwork technique to gain elevation. He was more successful now, having all 10 of his points making full contact with the snow. He was achieving full purchase. Each step on the icy face required focus. Even with hundreds of summits in the previous traffic, the steps that counted were shallow and widely spaced apart. The fixed line used to ascend felt loose, suffering from thousands of pulls just over the last few weeks. Climb with your legs, no jugging, Michael reminded himself as he took the pressure off his Jumar attached to the fixed line. The angle of the face suddenly increased. Aaron and Bart, now climbing together, talked about this section after their C3 rotation. Where did that come from? Aaron asked. Bart walked up behind him and said laughingly, I don't know, but when we go for the summit push, I'm gonna do the pied de card. Aaron threw his head back. Oh, the old duck foot technique. Ah, very good. Now they turned back. Bart turned back to Aaron and shouted, quack, quack, as he pointed his feet outward and splayed at a 90-degree angle. The sun peeked out as it rose above Lhotse. They had been moving for about 5 hours, making it faster than on the first rotation. Even Jim was going quicker, a point not lost on Pemba, Dawa, and John Paul. Pablo began to feel the altitude when he reached the middle of Camp 3 sites. Are you okay? Claudia asked. The steep angles, the cold temps, the howling wind gusts had conspired to sap his dwindling strength. He was losing both the physical and the mental game of climbing Mount Everest. I'm tired. I can't do this, he said, leaning with his hands on his knees, gasping for air. Claudia had a serious decision to make. Did she try to encourage him as she did on Aconcagua when he hit the wall of Camp 2 around 19,000 feet? But there he went on to summit the 22,834-foot peak. Now he was at 23,000 feet. Every step higher will be a personal altitude record. He had been struggling all trip, and her words had kept him positive. He tended to go to the dark side and became pessimistic and negative. On Denali, he gave up at high camp, and nothing she said could get him higher. John Paul caught up with him. Out of gas? We're close to our camp, John Paul shouted so they could hear him over the roar of the wind. Yeah, not sure what was wrong. No energy. I'm really hurting, Pablo shouted back. Pasang, his personal Sherpa, put his palm over his mouth and nose looking at John Paul, maybe suggesting putting him on O's with getting to C3. He was only 500 feet away, but doing about half an hour at his speed. John Paul looked at him. Look, we're close to C3. With this wind, it might be safer to get there and evaluate the next step rather than going back to C2. Claudia nodded. Pasang smiled at Pablo as he nodded back and did a thumbs up signal. Well, let's put you on O's, John Paul said as Pasang pulled a bottle, regulator, and mask out of his pack. They had anticipated this might happen to him, and they were prepared. Pablo saw the bottle and let his chin touch his chest. He felt defeated, embarrassed, as if he didn't belong there. He heard the voices of people back home when he would return. So, did you use oxygen, or did you climb Everest like a real climber? He avoided contact with anyone, especially Claudia. Harper gently reached over, touching his covered head with her bit. I love you no matter what. We all do. Chapter 42, Crossing the Yellow Band. Dutch and Tony shared a tent at Camp 3. I wish the wind had let up, Dutch said. The forecast called for it to let up about the time they arrived at Camp 3, but it hadn't. Same as last time, Tony mumbled. But we made it, a rare moment of conversation from him. Claudia and Pablo zipped their sleeping bags together. Harper was worried about him. He'd made it to camp, but just barely. Thanks to Pasang having a bottle of oxygen, Pablo was able to climb the last 500 feet instead of turning back and returning to C2. Now, he and Claudia, along with John Paul, had another big decision to make. The climbing Sherpas melted snow for water and for the freeze-dried food as most of the members tried to sleep. The winds violently shook the tent walls. Sleep was next to impossible. Now everyone was on supplemental oxygen running at a minimal flow of half a liter a minute. This was standard for commercial operators. From now on until they returned to Camp 2, oxygen would be their lifeline. How do you feel? Harper asked Bingba. They were sharing a tent. Good, Dee Dee, good. You? He seemed puzzled that Harper would even ask about him. Also good. I'm excited to get to the coal, Harper replied while putting her hand against the tent wall with it puffing against her face. The night passed as quickly as it could, but for almost everyone, sleep was elusive. Same thing happened on their rotation. But then they got back to base camp with richer oxygen allowed them all to recover. Now they were going higher. They were going to the summit of Mount Everest. The next phase would take them into the death zone. Swiss physician and alpinist Edward Wyss Dunant coined the term when he was with an expedition leader for the Everest 1952 Swiss team. They had reached 28,200 feet on the southeast ridge, setting a new climbing altitude record. He observed how the human body degraded above 26,000 feet, 8,000 meters, unable to process food, unable to sleep well. He saw his team lose their appetite. They just wanted to sleep. The lack of oxygen was slowly killing them. He first used the phrase death zone in an article about acclimatization published in the Journal of the Swiss Foundation for Alpine Research in 1953. Jim, sharing a tent with Michael, whispered, "I wish this wind had let up." His voice sounded thin. He'd been on O's all day long, and the cold oxygen caused his throat to dry out. "I just wish I could get this god-awful rice and chicken mush down," Jim chuckled. "Well, I chose poorly with my Italian-style pepper steak with rice and tomatoes," he said, reading off the foil bag. Usually these food bags would be filled with hot water, but it was virtually impossible to bring enough fuel in the time needed to make the water more than tepid. So the food, while nutritious, it lacked any taste. The climbers burned over 10,000 calories just yesterday getting to Camp 3, and they would replace less than a tenth of that with this dinner. This calorie deficit was part of why climbing an 8,000-meter mountain is so grueling. The sun rose, but it was still hiding behind Lhotse, the world's fourth highest peak at 27,940 feet. Tony wanted to make a Lhotse summit attempt after Everest, but with this iffy weather, he told John Paul he'd just be happy with Everest. John Paul was a bit disappointed because he too wanted to go for the double. Breakfast with a mixture of trail bars and high-flavored calorie gels. Harper liked Honey Stinger products because of the natural honey. Thinking of the honey reminded her of when Harper read on someone's blog who climbed Everest that he met a famous Japanese climber, Ichiro Miura, who attempted to ski down Everest in 1970. A documentary later showed him falling out of control down the Lhotse face with a parachute in tow to control his speed. She remembered how the blog was written. In 2008, Miura's son returned with his son to summit. He was then 75 years old. I love to tell the story how I met Mr. Miura in the icefall in 2008. He was taking a break, looking strong and confident. I went over to him and politely introduced myself. I said it was an honor to meet the man who skied down Everest. The old man just grinned and said, "I'm not the man who skied down Everest. I'm the man who fell down Everest." And we both laughed. I asked him what his secret was to climbing so well at such an advanced age as when he was peeling back the top to a thumb-sized container. He paused and continued his work, but then he smiled once again. Then he looked around as if he was telling a secret. He held up the container. Honey. He was a remarkable man with an amazing spirit. He had a history of heart issues and underwent surgery to correct a reoccurring arrhythmia last November, and again in January of this year before he did his 2008 expedition. In 2009, he had a skiing accident that left him with a broken pelvis and a fractured thigh. Harper thought about him as she peered down the Lhotse face, admiring his ambition and his courage, and also that he held the current record for summiting Everest, an age record of 80 on May 23rd, 2013. The song soon broke her out of her trance. "Didi, double check harness," he said as he tugged on the loose end of the already doubled back webbing. They were the first team to leave Camp 3. Today, everyone will be climbing with their personal Sherpa. John Paul went to Claudia and Pablo's tent. The wind had calmed to a light breeze, but it was still cold, somewhere around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. "How'd you sleep?" John Paul asked Pablo. He pulled his oxygen mask aside. "Okay, the wind drove me nuts, though." John Paul slid in the tent between Pablo and Claudia, his crampons hanging on his boots outside the tent door. "What do you want to do? How are you feeling?" Before Pablo could respond, Claudia spoke up. "Honey, I know yesterday was tough, but you made it. If you want to go down, I'll support you. But if you want to go to the Col, I think you can make it. I know you have reserves you haven't touched. You are stronger than you believe." John Paul then leaned forward. Pasang and I talked. He believes if you go at a slow pace, you can do it. Also, we have enough extra oxygen since Tony and I will not attempt Lhotse that you can start running on 4 liters per minute now. Pablo had been staring at John Paul's boots while he and Claudia spoke. In between fitful cat naps, he dwelled on this all night long. He felt better now that he had rested and was on O's, but did he feel strong enough not to become a burden on the team? About that time, Pasang came to the tent. He reached in and patted Pablo's leg. Then something else happened that surprised him. Jim came over. The old man was kneeling outside the tent. "Come on, kid, let's do this," he said with a gentle smile. Pablo felt supported like he never had by his teammates on any mountain, perhaps any time in his life. Okay, let's give this a go, he said, uncrossing his legs. Okay, then let's do it, John Paul said. Claudia's eyes just welled up, feeling the collective strength. She was proud of her mate's courage. Two by two, the member and the climbing Sherpa left the security of their tents and clipped into the fixed lines that rose seemingly forever straight up. The route felt steep. Bart was back to his duck step while Aaron was sidestepping. There was a line of climbers ahead and behind them, perhaps 150 people on the route today. Thank God that wind calmed, Aaron said. They climbed for about an hour so their body warmed up. Covered in goose down, they were comfortable, warm, and confident. The boot track took a sharp turn left, directly towards a band of yellowish sandstone that covers the Himalayas in this area around 25,000 feet. It's called the Yellow Band. The team arrived at the base of the band. It's about 300 feet high and its sections appear to be steep, but closer inspection showed the fixed line weaved around the steep parts and followed shallow snow gullies. Dutch clipped in, placing his right foot on a section where the sandstone. His crampon scraped across the smooth stone, returning his foot to the spot where he started, laughing to himself. Some climber I am, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. He tried again, this time placing his foot on the snow instead of the rock. As he stepped up, something caught his eye. It was circular, about 1 inch long. He had found a fossil, a stem of sea lilies, Coronide oscies, a marine organism with a skeleton. Dutch, like Harper, had studied Everest before coming, so he knew at one point this land that now defined Everest was actually underwater. But he was seeing a marine fossil. That was unbelievable, but it was true. He moved on, even more amazed by this experience and what it was teaching him. It didn't take long for the team to cross the band. The angle eased. Harper paused for a moment to look back at C3. It seemed so far away now. The yellow tents were just specks. Harper looked down the Lhotse face all the way down into the western cone. It was a beautifully clear day. The sun now well over Lhotse. Harper unzipped her down suit a few inches to vent. Basang standing behind her, he also took in the view. No matter how many times he had climbed Everest, 17 actually, he was always amazed at the beauty of Chomolungma. The track began to rise as it melded into the mountainside. They were now on the Geneva Spur, a rock buttress that blocked them from reaching the South Col. For the first time, they would actually do climbing. Claudia looked up to inspect the obstacle. It was 150 feet of 40-degree rock, ice, and snow. The fixed line showed the route. She paused to watch other climbers scurry across the rock. They followed the uneven rock that provided spots for good foot placement. But what caught her eye was Everest. She looked at the southeast ridge with amazement. It was steep, just like John Paul had told him. It looked daunting. A doubt entered her mind. She swiftly changed her thoughts. Pablo was moving well now. The extra oxygen was doing the trick. He, Claudia, Jim, John Paul, plus 6 climbing Sherpas moved as a pod toward the spur. At the top of the spur, Tony was expecting to see the tents of the South Col, but all he saw was a narrow boot path that disappeared into the horizon. How far now? He wondered. Clipping into the fixed line, he started walking, slowly. He let the moment sink in. The boot path was almost flat. I must be on the Col, he thought. And then they appeared. Tents, tons of tents, and yellow oxygen bottles stacked neatly. There must have been 500 cylinders stacked across the Col. He looked to his left. The triangular face was in full view. Climbers were coming down. Did they summit? He asked Dawa, who was standing next to him. Yep, over 50 this morning, the proud Siddhar replied. And we will too, in 20 hours. Tony's eyes traced the visible boot path. And without warning, a wind gust knocked the 2 men off the balance.